More than 2,000 people died on the spot. In Beijing, there is a famous place called Tiananmen Square. Did the event that killed 2,000 people take place here? Overview of the Tiananmen Square Incident. In mid-1986, an astrophysics professor named Feng Liqi returned from Princeton University and he started his personal tour around universities in China. He went around preaching that reform in China was extremely slow due to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and that for the country to develop, it needed to follow Western trends. His speeches were broadcast across the country and were well received by students, and the first demonstrations originated here. In December 1986, crowds of people held demonstrations against the slow pace of reform. They took to the streets and demanded economic liberalization. This reached the ears of the top leaders of the Communist Party at that time, and they ordered the suppression of the protests, arrest protest leaders and suppress protests at the time. However, General Secretary Hu Yaobang was soon blamed for his soft attitude and mishandling of the protests, thus undermining social stability. He was severely condemned by conservatives and was removed as Secretary General on 16 January 1987. On April 15, 1989, Hu Yaobang died of a heart attack, but the students did not think so. They reacted strongly because they believed his death was related to his resignation. More than 100,000 students demonstrated to meet their demands. Faced with the above situation, China was now divided into two factions. The moderate faction led by General Secretary Zhao Ziyang wanted to dialogue and persuade the protesters to disperse, and the other faction led by the Lebanese Prime Minister wanted to completely suppress them. However, because Mr. Tru Tuduang is the nominal head of the country, he compromised with the protesters, saying that it is reasonable for students to care about the country's problems and they should go home to study and try to develop the country. Most of the students left, but some of the more stubborn ones decided to stay and demand more concessions from the government, so the protest continued. Unlucky for China, because at this time the China-Soviet summit was taking place in Tiananmen, the two sides normalized relations after decades of confrontation. Because this is a world-class summit, journalists from all over come to follow. The protesters seized this opportunity to stage a hunger strike with the aim of forcing the government to make concessions if it were not long before the government had a place to hold the event. Martial law. Faced with this situation, the government decided to impose martial law to make them pay the price. The Chinese government imposed martial law on May 20 and mobilized more than 250,000 troops to the capital, Beijing. The army's entry into the city was blocked in the suburbs by crowds of protesters. Tens of thousands of protesters surrounded military vehicles, preventing them from advancing and forcing them to retreat. After discussions among the leadership, a military solution to the crisis was proposed. Soldiers and tanks were brought into the city. On the evening of June 2, after receiving reports that a military bulldozer had run over and killed 3 civilians. Protesters feared that the army was trying to enter Tiananmen Square, so student leaders set up emergency barricades at major intersections in an attempt to stop the army from entering the city center. On the morning of June 3, students and residents discovered plainclothes soldiers trying to bring weapons into the city. The students confiscated them and handed them over to Beijing police. Unarmed troops appeared at the Great Hall of the People and were met by a crowd of protesters. Some people attacked the soldiers outside, forcing them to retreat. However, at 4:30 p.m., the National Assembly met and decided to end the demonstration. Tiananmen must be cleared by the morning of June 4. On the evening of the 3rd of the following month, state television warned people to stay indoors, but some people still went out to protest. Liberation Army units advanced into Beijing from all directions. And then the battle between the army and protesters lasted all night. The protesters were not pushovers either. They prepared petrol bombs and homemade weapons to attack the army. The military also responded fiercely, causing casualties on both sides. Some people said that the army used machine guns to shoot at protesters, and they used tanks to ram straight into the crowd. There is particular evidence that the military used expanding bullets, a banned type of ammunition, to fire at protesters. Wall Street Journal reporter reported that, after tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers approached Tiananmen, large columns of troops were set up by angry crowds of protesters, shouting the words, "Fascist." Dozens of soldiers were dragged from their trucks, brutally beaten, and left to die on the side of the road. At an intersection west of the square, the body of a young soldier, who had been beaten to death, was stripped naked and hung from the side of a bus. The corpse of another soldier was hung at an intersection east of the square. By the next morning, all the protesters had disappeared. According to many sources, more than 2,000 people had died and it was unclear where their bodies had gone. The army had cleared the square. Thank you for watching the video.